The morning I drove home from the attorney's office, I had the windows down. Warm Georgia air, the kind that smells like cut grass and possibility. I had a check. Well, not a check exactly, but paperwork, confirming that my older brother Gerald had left me everything. A 3-bedroom house in Savannah, a rental property in Charleston, and an investment portfolio worth just over $2 million. Gerald never married, never had children, just worked, saved, and apparently decided his little brother deserved the life he'd spent 63 years building. I remember gripping the steering wheel and laughing out loud in that car, alone, like a fool, because my first thought wasn't about the money. My first thought was my son, Daniel. I wanted to call him right then and tell him. I wanted to hear his voice go quiet with disbelief and then break open with gratitude. I had been helping Daniel and his wife Claire for years. Small things here and there, a few hundred when the car needed work, a couple thousand when they were short on rent. Nothing that hurt me, but nothing that changed their lives either. This would change their lives. That's what I kept thinking on that drive. This changes everything for Daniel. I pulled into the neighborhood and cut the engine in front of their house. It was a Tuesday. Claire's car was in the driveway, which surprised me a little. She usually worked until 4. I figured I'd knock, sit down at the kitchen table, and tell them both together. Maybe take them to dinner after. I was already planning where we'd go. I was halfway up the front walk when I heard their voices through the screen door. It was cracked open because of the heat, and sound travels in a way you don't expect when you're outside and other people think they're alone. I wasn't trying to listen. I want to be honest about that. I was 3 steps from the porch when Claire's voice came through the screen, clearly enough that I stopped moving. "He's not going to live forever," she said. There was a pause, and then Daniel said something I couldn't catch. His voice was lower. "I'm not talking about waiting," Claire said. "I'm talking about being smart. We need to be the ones he trusts most. That's all I'm saying." I stood there on the front walk. A neighbor's dog was barking somewhere down the street. The sun was hot on the back of my neck. Daniel said something again, and this time I caught it. He doesn't even know what he has. He lives in that house like it's still 1987. Claire laughed. It was a short, brittle sound. Exactly. So we be present. We be attentive. We make sure there's no one else. "There is no one else," Daniel said. "It's just him." "Good," she said. "Then we don't have to compete. We just have to be patient and not screw it up." I don't know how long I stood there. Long enough that my legs went stiff. Long enough that the neighbor's dog stopped barking and the street went quiet. I had papers in my hand, the attorney's folder, the same one I'd been planning to open on Daniel's kitchen table. I looked down at it. Then I turned around. I walked back to my car. I sat inside it for what felt like a very long time, and I did not cry. I want to say that clearly. I did not cry. I just sat there and felt something drain out of me that I wasn't sure would ever come back. I drove home. I didn't call Daniel that night, or the night after. I put Gerald's folder in the drawer of my nightstand, and I lay in bed in the dark and I thought about the years. I thought about Daniel at 7 years old, running across a parking lot to grab my hand. I thought about his college graduation, the way he'd hugged me after, how he smelled like cheap aftershave and pride. I thought about his wedding day 5 years ago, how I'd paid for the rehearsal dinner and half the honeymoon because they were stretched thin, and how Daniel had shaken my hand and said, "Dad, I don't know how to thank you." I thought about Claire at Christmas, calling me the sweetest father-in-law in Georgia, squeezing my arm when she said it. I thought about what she'd said through the screen door. "He's not going to live forever. Be patient, and don't screw it up. I am 63 years old. I have arthritis in both hands, a trick knee from a fall off a ladder 12 years ago, and I take 1 blood pressure pill in the morning with my coffee. I am not wealthy, or I wasn't before Gerald died. I own my house outright. I have modest savings, and I live comfortably but not extravagantly. I drive a 7-year-old truck. I shop sales. Daniel has watched me live this way his entire life. He has no reason to believe I'm sitting on anything. Or he didn't. And that's when it occurred to me, lying there in the dark. How did they know to talk about this right now? Had something changed? Had Daniel noticed something? Gerald's death had been in the paper. A small notice. His last name was the same as mine. Was that it? Had Daniel seen it and started adding things up? I got up, went to the kitchen, and poured a glass of water. I stood at the sink, looking out at the backyard. Gerald used to sit out there with me on summer evenings, drinking sweet tea and arguing about baseball. He was the kind of man who repaired things instead of replacing them and called you out when you were making excuses. I missed him in a way that still surprised me. And standing there at the sink, I decided something. I was not going to confront Daniel. Not yet. Not without knowing more. I was going to be quiet and careful, and I was going to watch. Daniel called the next morning. Normal tone, normal timing, the weekly check-in call we'd had for years. I answered like nothing had happened. "Hey, Dad, how you doing?" "Good," I said. "Knee's a little stiff. How are you two?" "Good, good." "Hey, Claire was thinking we should have you over for dinner this week. She's been saying she feels bad that we haven't seen you in a while." I looked out the window. "That would be nice," I said. Dinner was Friday. I brought a bottle of wine, nothing fancy, $16, and when I walked in, Claire hugged me a beat longer than usual. She'd made a real meal. Tablecloth, candles, the good dishes, the kind of dinner you make when you want someone to feel valued. Halfway through, she said, "Dad, you seem like something's on your mind. Everything okay?" I looked at her. I'd always thought Claire was smart. She'd confirmed it. "Just a lot going on," I said. Gerald's estate. Some paperwork to sort through. The table went quiet in a way that had weight to it. "Right," Daniel said carefully. "That must be a lot to deal with. Did Gerald leave much behind?" I cut a piece of chicken. "Some things," I said. "Mostly personal items. You know how Gerald was. Didn't believe in accumulating a lot." Daniel nodded and reached for his wine. "Of course." "That sounds right." Claire changed the subject smoothly, back to something about their neighborhood, a new restaurant opening nearby. She was good. I'll give her that. I drove home that night knowing two things. They suspected I had something, and they were willing to be patient to get to it. That's almost worse than desperation. Desperation makes people sloppy. Patience makes them strategic. Over the next few weeks, the attention became steady and particular. Daniel started calling more often. He came by one Saturday to fix a gutter he'd noticed was sagging, something he'd never offered to do before, and spent 3 hours on a ladder, cheerful and helpful. Claire started texting me recipes I might like. Little notes that ended with hearts. They invited me to their friend's cookout, introduced me warmly, called me the best dad. One evening, Claire mentioned almost casually that they'd been thinking about buying a bigger house, but that the down payment was really the challenge. I said, That's tough. Market's rough right now." I offered nothing else. She nodded and talked about something else. A few days later, Daniel took me to lunch. Just the two of us, which was unusual. He chose a nice place, not the diner we normally went to. He was warm, attentive, filled my coffee before I asked. And then at the end of the meal, he leaned back and said, "Dad, I want to ask you something, and I hope it doesn't come across wrong." "Go ahead," I said. "Claire and we've been thinking about our future. Trying to be responsible, you know? And I just wonder, and tell me if this is out of line, but if anything ever happened to you, do you have things written down? Like, have you thought about a will?" I looked at my son across that table. He was 41 years old. He had my father's jawline and his mother's eyes, and he was asking me, in a restaurant, whether I had a will, 6 weeks after his wife said she was playing the long game on my estate. "I have a lawyer I work with," I said. "Everything's in order." "That's good," Daniel said, and he smiled with all his teeth. "That's really good, Dad. Claire worries about these things, you know. She loves you. I know she does." I said. I called Gerald's attorney the following Monday. Her name was Patricia Webb, and she had handled Gerald's estate efficiently and without sentiment, which I'd appreciated. I told her I needed to update my own will and estate plan and that I had a particular set of circumstances I wanted to think through carefully. She said, "Come in Thursday." I spent the better part of 2 hours in her office. I told her what I had: Gerald's properties, the portfolio, my own house. I told her what I'd heard through the screen door. I told her about the dinner with the good dishes and the gutter and the lunch and the question about my will. I laid it out like evidence, because that's what it felt like. Patricia listened without interrupting. When I finished, she folded her hands on the desk and said, "What do you want to do?" "I want to protect what I have," I said, "and I want it to go where it should go." "Do you have other family?" "A daughter," I said. "Renee. She lives in Portland. We talk every week. She has never once asked me about money." I hadn't mentioned Renee yet because I hadn't wanted to think about the comparison. But sitting in that office, it landed on me fully. Renee, who called me every Sunday morning, without fail. Renee, who drove down last Thanksgiving when I had a bad cold, sat with me for 3 days, made soup, watched old movies. Renee, who had never once in her life said anything about what I had or what I'd leave behind. Not once. I thought about Daniel on that walk, the one up to the house that day, and I thought about Renee sitting on my couch with a box of tissues while I blew my nose through football games. I thought about what the word family actually means when you get down to the thing itself. Patricia and I worked out a structure. Everything: Gerald's properties, the portfolio, my own house, would pass into a trust managed by Patricia's firm, with Renee as the primary beneficiary. Daniel would not be excluded entirely. He would receive a modest sum, enough to feel that his father had remembered him, not enough to reward what I'd heard through that screen door. The trust would also include a provision I'd asked for specifically. If any beneficiary engaged in legal action to contest the distribution, their share would be forfeited entirely. Patricia said it was airtight. I signed the papers on a Wednesday afternoon in October. The drive home felt different from the drive back from Gerald's attorney. Quieter. No windows down. No laughing to myself. Just the road. It was 2 months later that things came to a head in a way I hadn't entirely planned. Daniel and Claire had continued their campaign steadily, but I noticed Claire growing less patient. Small signs of sharpness at the edge of her warmth when I deflected questions, a look that passed between her and Daniel when I'd say something deliberately vague about finances. She was calculating the timeline and starting to find it long. One Sunday, Daniel came by alone. He sat down at my kitchen table with both hands wrapped around a coffee mug and said he needed to be honest with me about something. I told him to go ahead. "Claire and I are in some financial trouble," he said. "We got behind on some things: credit cards, mostly, and there's a business idea I've been pursuing that's needed more capital than I expected." He looked down. "I hate asking. I really do. But I'm asking, Dad. Can you help us?" I looked at my son for a long moment. "How much?" I said. "60,000, he said. "Enough to clear the cards and get the business off the ground." $60,000. 3 years ago, he would have asked for 500 and been grateful. The number told me everything about what they believed I was sitting on. I set my coffee down. I said, "Daniel, I want to ask you something first." He nodded. "Do you remember last summer? I came by on a Tuesday afternoon, around 2 o'clock. I parked out front." He looked at me without recognition. "The screen door was open," I said. Something crossed his face. Quick, like a cloud shadow. Then it was gone, replaced by the careful expression he'd been wearing for months. "I don't remember a specific Tuesday," he said. "I do," I said. "I remember it very clearly." The kitchen was quiet. Outside, a lawnmower started up somewhere down the block. Daniel put his coffee down. He didn't say anything. "I was coming to tell you about Gerald's estate," I said. I had the paperwork in my hand. "I was going to tell you at the kitchen table. Maybe take you to dinner after." I paused. I didn't make it to the door. He sat with that for a moment. I watched his face go through something private and complicated. Then he said, quietly, "Dad, that's not we were just talking. You have to understand the position we're in. It wasn't like it sounds. What was it like?" I said. He didn't answer. "I have a question for you," I said. "And I want you to think before you answer. Not the answer that sounds good. The real one." I looked at him. "Have you called me every week because I'm your father, or because of what you think I might have?" He looked at the table for a long time, and in that silence I got my answer, which was the same as getting no answer at all. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't tell him about the trust or about Patricia Webb or about the provisions I'd signed. I didn't mention Renee. I just told him I couldn't give him $60,000, that I lived carefully on what I had, and that if his finances were difficult, I loved him and I hoped he'd find a way through. He left 20 minutes later. Claire called the next morning, warm and careful, clearly working from whatever version Daniel had given her. I was polite and brief. Renee called that Sunday as she always does. I didn't tell her about the trust then. I wasn't ready to. We talked about her job, her garden, a book she was reading. At the end of the call, she said, "You sound a little tired, Dad. Are you doing okay?" "I'm good," I said. "Just thinking about some things." "Okay," she said. "I love you. Call me if you need me." After I hung up, I sat in the living room for a while with the phone in my hand. Gerald used to say something when we were kids. He was 8 years older than me and could be insufferably wise about it. He used to say that the people who love you don't keep a tally. He meant it about everything. About favors, about time, about attention. The people who love you give without counting, and you know who they are because they don't flinch when the count doesn't come back even. I have thought about that a lot this past year. I am not angry at Daniel. I want to be honest about that too. What I feel is something more like grief. The particular kind that comes from understanding someone more completely than you wanted to. He is my son, and I love him in the way that doesn't come undone just because it's been disappointed. But love and trust are not the same thing, and what I built with Patricia Webb was built on that distinction. Someday Daniel will learn what the estate contained. He'll receive what I left him, and he'll know that it was less than he'd counted on, and he'll understand why. I don't know what he'll do with that understanding. I hope it changes something. I hope he looks at Claire and they have an honest conversation, and that somewhere in the middle of it he remembers a Tuesday afternoon in the summer when his father stood on the front walk with papers in his hand, and that he feels what that cost me. I hope so. But I didn't build the trust on hope. I built it on what I know. Gerald's house in Savannah is a good house. White siding. A wide porch. 2 blocks from the water. I drove down to see it last spring, walked through the rooms, stood on the porch in the evening, and listened to the neighborhood settle into night. Gerald lived alone in that house for 30 years, and by all accounts, he was content. He knew what he had. He knew who he was. He didn't perform either of those things for anyone. I locked up the house that night and drove back to Atlanta with the radio low. The inheritance papers were handled. The trust was in place. And the people who mattered knew they were loved. Even if not all of them, knew yet how much. That's enough for a man to carry home.